Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Wojtkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Mary Beltrán is an associate professor in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and was the founding director of the Latino Media Arts and Studies program, both at University of Texas at Austin. Cristal Camargo, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film at Northwestern, and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Mary in just a minute. I'm also delighted to know that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Latina and Latino Studies program, all at Northwestern. Before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Crystal will tell us more about Mary's research and career in just a minute. Then Mary will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Crystal will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Crystal, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Pablo, and for the opportunity to introduce today's speaker, whose scholarship and kindness has greatly influenced me as a young scholar, but most importantly, whose scholarship has been foundational in the area of both Latinx and digital media studies, in, for example, TV and film stardom, authorship, and representation, amongst many other areas. In other words, I'm deeply honored to be introducing today's speaker and moderating the Q&A with Mary, someone that I admire. Dr. Mary Beltrán is an Associate Chair of Media Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film at the University of Texas at Austin. She was a founding director of the Latino Media Arts and Studies program at UT Austin and is an active affiliate of the Department of Mexican American and Latina Studies and the Center for Women's and Gendered Studies. Before her return to Austin, where she completed her doctoral studies, Dr. Beltrán was an assistant and later associate professor of media and cultural studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has also worked closely with the Ford Foundation on multiple capacities, including a research project that examined the employment and representation of people of color in U.S. entertainment television. At the intersections of U.S. television and film studies, critical race studies, and gendered studies, Dr. Beltrán's critical and cultural studies-driven scholarship and teaching are focused on U.S. television and film history with an emphasis on Latina representation and authorship, as well as race and ethnicity in U.S. media industries at large. She is the author of Latina Stars in U.S. Eyes, The Making and Meanings of Film and TV Stardom, and the forthcoming Latino TV Negotiations of U.S. Storytelling. Dr. Beltrán is also a co-editor of the pioneering collection Mixed Race. Sorry about that. That was my technological issue there. Dr. Beltrán is also a co-editor of the pioneering collection Mixed Race Hollywood and is currently co-editing a special issue on Latina media histories for a special issue of Feminist Media Histories. This special issue, as well as her forthcoming book, are scheduled to be published in fall 2021. So keep an eye out for both. I know I certainly will. Drawn from a larger study of Latino Latina narratives and authorship in US English language television, today's talk titled Latino Latina TV Histories and Cultural Citizenship, 80s Network Failures and a.k.a. Pablo Dr. Beltran shines light on the industrial and social climate that influenced the 80s series featuring Latino and Latina main characters. Using the 1984 Norman Lear-led sitcom a.k.a. Pablo as a case study, Dr. Beltrán examines the network failures, illuminating the limitations of Latino-Latina cultural citizenship in relationship to TV then and today. Without further ado, Dr. Mary Beltrán.
Thank you, Crystal and Pablo and the Center for Latinx Digital Media. I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of your seminar series and to share some of this work in progress and hear everyone's feedback and reactions in particular. I'm going to do a share screen here and hopefully this will work. We shall see. Takes just a minute for these slides to come up in this new way of sharing. Here we go. So as Crystal had mentioned, this research that I'll be presenting is part of a book that is finally getting completed after about 5 years of research and writing. And so this particular chapter of the book is focused on the 1980s and also 1990s. I ended up realizing I had a little too much material for the talk today to focus on the 90s as well. So mostly I'll be looking at the 1980s. And first, let me give you just a really quick glimpse of the book itself as a whole, coming out from NYU Press. Hopefully it would be late this year, early next year. Latino TV Navigations of US Storytelling. And this began in part out of just, my interest in trying to fill the humongous gap that we have in Latino television studies, looking at that history in English language television from the 50s until today. There just simply is no book length project that attempts to provide a bit of an overview. And clearly no one book can cover everything. There's just no way. I did have to make some tough choices about how to try to still have some focus in each chapter. And so I look almost, just very little at children's television. This is strictly on narrative TV, except for one chapter, I guess I should say there is a chapter that focuses on public television in the 1970s. And so some of those shows actually did have a news component to them. I can show you, let's see, I'll show you just the chapter listing before I begin to talk about my case study. But, there were a lot of different ways that I could approach looking at this subject. And I knew that I wanted to focus as much as I could on documenting the content of the shows themselves and how they were produced, and the impact of Latina and Latino creatives, writers, and producers when they did begin to make their way into the industry. And so much of what my main focus ends up being is this topic of cultural citizenship. And in particular, I wanted to really think about, what does it mean to be a Latina, Latino, Latinx writer, and to be able to tell your own stories. And so from that, the central concepts that much of the work hangs on are those of cultural citizenship, having a voice in the media, and being able to create honest depictions. I'm still working on some of my thinking about this as I'm finishing my revisions. But it's not about authenticity per se. Obviously, that's a subjective concept that really is not very useful as a scholar, but more about being honest to our own cultural memories and histories. And so it's more about the concept, like Gloria Ansaldúa talks about, making face, being able to tell our own stories, present the face that's honest to ourselves, to the world, not having someone else do that for us. And so authorship ends up being a pretty major concept within the book itself. But it was tricky because there's so much unwritten. And so like the chapter titles that are here, for the most part, they look at different decades. And so the 1950s and especially TV Westerns are the focus in chapter 1. I did not do a chapter on I Love Lucy, in part because I had looked at Desi Arnaz and other research. I have my second chapter on the rise of activist-oriented Chicano and Nuyorican television, mostly produced at public TV stations, but sometimes also at local affiliates of networks. The third chapter is also focused on the 70s, but looking at commercial television and shows like Chico and the Man, and the ways in which, even though we had many Chicanos and Latinos involved in public TV production, that's not happening yet in commercial TV. Chapter 4 is what I'm drawing from today, looking at shows that began to appear with Latina or Latino main characters, mostly Latino main characters in the 80s and 90s, all of which were seen as failures, and none of which lasted beyond a season. And so a lot of this research was detective work in simply trying to track down video, production materials, attempting to interview people that sometimes worked on these series or were actors within them, but really still trying to learn about how industry norms were marginalizing Latino characters and also often Latino professionals that were trying to break in. Chapter 5 begins to look at Latino TV creators, as in the 2000s, we have the very first Latino-led TV series. And then finally in chapter 6, I bring things more up to date, looking at new shows of the 2010s, often on streaming media outlets, and actually often with Latina showrunners and Latino writers. And so I get to look at quite an evolution. And I realize I should jump ahead because time is flying, and I should talk about the actual case study that I'll be playing. Now I do not think I will get to play this song here. I have a little song bit, but let me begin with my piece from this chapter. Paul Rodriguez's 2017 play, The Pitch, or How to Pitch a Latino Sitcom That Will Never Air, at the Los Angeles Theater Center, included Lalo Guerrero's Rice song, No Chicanos on TV, as part of its opening. To offer a taste of the song, this is how it began. I think that I shall never see any Chicanos on TV. It seems as though we don't exist and we're not even missed. And yet we buy and buy their wares, but no Chicanos anywhere. It was perhaps the play's most lighthearted moment. The pitch depicted the challenges of pitching a series about Latino characters and weathering the reception from network executives of flattery, stalling, and ultimate rejection. As Rodriguez said in an interview after I watched the production, it aimed to skewer the injustice and absurdity of this soul-crushing cycle. Rodriguez and his co-stars, Mike Gomez and John Lopez, playing his real-life son, Paul Rodriguez Jr., reenact the many pitch meetings he had attended at the Big Four. The trio is left endlessly sitting in waiting rooms as receptionists and entry-level staff offer them beverages and make lame excuses for their boss's delays, and in some cases, actual absence from the building or the city. The audience also witnesses development meetings in which cultural misinformation about Latinos results in insulting suggestions, and in which Rodriguez and his team are presumed incapable of taking the lead in writing and producing the series they created. In the end, as Guerrero's song intimates, nothing results from the meetings, and there still are no Chicanos or Latinos on TV. The pitch offered a glimpse into network programming development that few Latinos could know. 33 years earlier, Rodriguez, then an up-and-coming comedian, had been promoted as the next Freddie Prinze when he was cast in the sitcom a.k.a. Pablo on ABC in 1984. It was Norman Lear's first Latino series to make it to broadcast. Because of this pedigree, a.k.a. Pablo got more promotion than most series with Latino stars, but it wasn't renewed after its truncated six-episode season. When two other series in which he later co-starred were also short-lived, Rodriguez turned to stand-up comedy and a career in smaller roles in films and television. His experience was representative of missteps that were commonly made in the 80s and 90s when networks made attempts at Latino-centric programming. In these years, about a dozen series with a Latino or Latina lead character progressed from the nebulous stage of development to air as a pilot, partial, or full season of episodes. Very few Latino professionals were involved in their conception and production, and none in leadership roles. Notably, all but one of these series were situation comedies, half-hour series shot affordably on a set. There also was a dearth of Latinos on their writing teams. Even while the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Imagen, the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts, the National Council of La Raza, and other groups acted as television watchdogs in these years, they had less sway than groups such as Justicia in the 1970s, and certainly the NAACP with regard to influencing the still white and male-dominated networks. Several of these series were star vehicles. After 1970s audiences responded so well to Freddie Prinze and Chico and the Man, the thought of a Latino or Latina star vehicle built around the perceived charms of a particular performer was no longer unthinkable. Maria Conchita Alonso, a Cuban-born Venezuelan actress who had appeared in several Hollywood films, was given a chance to star in One of the Boys in 1989. While Edward James Olmos was able to negotiate a non-exclusive contract and creative control over his character on the uber-popular Miami Vice after successes in theater and film. Despite the charms of these performers, their shows and the other Latino shows of the 80s and 90s didn't draw large enough audiences to convince the networks to keep them on the air. And in truth, most of the series were flawed in various ways. Even so, there's still reasons to study them, as how they were bad is informative with regard to how Latino authorship and perspectives were stymied. Considering that these series were the primary attempts at creating Latino narratives and protagonists for television in these decades, peeling back these layers helps us understand the common assumptions being made in the industry about Latino cultures, appeal, creatives, and audiences. With this social and industrial history in mind, I examined how a number of these series were produced and promoted in a manner that undercut their potential to showcase Latina and Latino voices, and how Latino actors and writers navigated their participation in their making. To do so, I searched for and studied whatever traces could be found of these series in their productions, and when possible, conducted interviews with professionals involved. For each, archive materials were almost non-existent, an illustration of the lack of attention to archiving artifacts related to the cultural history of Latino Americans. Often, only extra textual traces, such as a print advertisement that had run in TV Guide, could be found. I then homed in on case studies in each decade to investigate in depth the industry norms that got in the way of creating more compelling narratives. As a case study of the 80s, I turned to a.k.a. Pablo, the Paul Rodriguez sitcom described above. The 1980s brought some optimism, but ultimately few changes for Latinos in television. This is somewhat surprising, as Latinos were becoming more visible in other realms of popular culture, especially film. A number of Latino-directed feature films, including Gregory Nava's El Norte and Luis Valdez's Zoot Suit, debuted to critical acclaim at film festivals and found distributors, reaching a national audience for the first time. Meanwhile, The African-American family sitcom, The Cosby Show, was a major hit for NBC. These developments encouraged some producers to pitch new series built around Latina or Latino performers who showed promise to appeal to a national audience. Latino writers were still typically not invited to contribute to these productions or to create their own series, however. And I'm going to show you a slide. Here we go. The storylines of these series were different from one another, but often rooted in a grab bag of universal comedy ideas rather than in Mexican-American or other Latino cultural histories. ABC's Condo cast Cuban-American actor Luis Avalos of Electric Company fame as the patriarch of a middle-class Mexican-American family that clashes with the stuffy white upper-class couple in the condo next door. Comedy ensues, especially when their daughter marries the other family's son. I Married Dora starred the late Elizabeth Pena as a refugee and doctor from El Salvador, working as a nanny who marries her employer to avoid deportation. Afterwards, she continues her work as the family nanny while they try to ignore their mutual attraction. CBS's Fort Figueroa, about a white Midwestern farm family that moves to a working class LA neighborhood when the father inherits an apartment building there, was an East LA focused Beverly Hillbillies. They're forced to question their cultural assumptions and fears as they get to know their neighbors, Latino and Vietnamese families. And ABC's One of the Boys, a star vehicle for Maria Conchita Alonso, was likewise a culture clash romantic comedy about a Cuban Venezuelan free spirit who gets a job as a secretary for a construction company only to fall in love with the owner, a white widower with 3 adult sons. It was bland and promoted largely with an emphasis on Alonso's beauty and body. Finally, the first Latino series to air on a cable network, Sanchez of Bel-Air, must have been envisioned as a Latino Jeffersons. It was a comedy about a Mexican-American family that has moved on up from East LA, and there's a lot of East LA, to the Tony neighborhood of Bel-Air. While it likely pleased some Latino viewers who wanted to see more images of Latino professionals, it had a generic feel and mostly uncompelling characters. The series was poorly promoted and not renewed after its season of 13 episodes aired. It was within this era of misguided attempts that a.k.a. Pablo premiered on ABC, underscoring new possibilities for Latino subjectivity in television. A comedy about Paul Rivera, a stand-up comedian who lives with his large and colorful extended family, it was centered around comedian Paul Rodriguez, who was beginning to reach a level of success similar to his character. Lear, for his part, approached the creation of a series about a Latino family with more cultural sensitivity than previous non-Latino showrunners. He assembled a creative team that actually included a Latino writer, Jose Rivera, and hired 2 Latina consultants invited to provide feedback in the development stage of the production. The team took pains to conduct research on and to immerse themselves in Mexican-American life in Los Angeles, as Junine Merely documents in a 1987 study. As Rodriguez describes in a 2000 interview with the American Comedy Archives, his first encounter with Lear was after a stand-up set at the LA Comedy Store. Impressed, Lear invited him in for a meeting. At the time, Lear had a 6-episode deal to try out a new series. He was planning to remake Que Pasa USA, a Cuban-American family series produced by Miami public television station WPBT, and he was thinking of casting Rodriguez as one of the family members. Rodriguez declined, telling Lear that he was Mexican, not Cuban. They talked further about Rodriguez's family and Mexican-American cultural quirks, the fodder of much of Rodriguez's comedy at the time, and Rodriguez invited him to dinner at his parents' house in Compton to see for himself. Lear went and decided then to base his new series on Rodriguez's family, with Rodriguez as star. With Rick Mitz, Lear created a.k.a. Pablo. It changed Rodriguez's life dramatically. As he stated in the Comedy Archive interview, it was a true story, as true as it could possibly be, about my family, how so many of us lived at home. And I went from nobody knew who the hell you were to, within a period of 6 months, my face was on the cover of TV Guide. Aside from Rodriguez, several Latino actors, but few of Mexican descent, were cast as Paul Rivera's family. They cast Italian-American actor Joe Santos and Mexican film actress Katy Barrado as his parents, while Hector Elizondo, of Basque and Puerto Rican heritage, played his agent, Jose Sanchez, also known as Joe Shapiro. Jose Rivera, a Puerto Rican screenwriter now known for Motorcycle Diaries and On the Road, was hired as one of the writers. Although material from Rodriguez's stand-up comedy was at times included in the script, he strangely was not given credit as a writer. He also did not have executive producer status on the series, as we sometimes see for Latino television stars today. In an unusual move, there were attempts on the part of Lear and Mitz to draw input from members of the cast and crew, including the Latina consultants mentioned earlier, on the storylines of the 6 episodes. Mayerly notes that Embassy Television was known for collaborative creative process in this phase. This had been the case for The Jeffersons and the original One Day at a Time. Despite this, the production's original vision of representing the perspectives of all of the members of a large and loving family disintegrated at this stage, with the eventual episodes focusing primarily on Paul and on his stand-up, and thus jokes about the foibles of Mexican-American culture. The shift was due largely to the writer's ideas of what would work and appeal in television comedy. More aware of the burden of representation that Mexican-American carried in 1984, the consultants, Dolores Sanchez and Helen Hernandez, voiced their concerns about narrative elements that bothered them, such as characterizing Paul's parents as foolish and out of step with American society. However, they ultimately had to accept that they would not change the minds of the writers. As one of the consultants, Dolores Sanchez, indicated, it was a compromise that I didn't willingly accept, but that I realized had to be made. I know how we Hispanics think, but it isn't always funny. I have writers telling me, well, you know, we have to do such and such thing because it will work on television. I couldn't very well dispute that. ABC and NBC Television appear to have put some money into initial promotion of the series and Rodriguez as a star. They emphasized the colorful, chaotic excess of Pablo's family and Paul and Pablo's irreverent comedy about Mexican-American culture. Lear, in an appearance on Good Morning America on the day of the debut on March 6, 1984, described the series as representative of many Americans' experiences. This is about a large Mexican family, a Mexican-American family, at a time when 240 million Americans are desperate for some feeling of connection and belonging, he noted. And here's a family with 16 people who would fight the world for each other, who love each other and who belong to each other. It is a mirror of that new, fresh immigrant experience in our culture. The pilot introduces Paul and his large and passionate family with whom he lives in East LA. The original credit sequence emphasizes the size and excitability of the family and moments from Rivera's work as a comedian, particularly a joke about the Mexican Express card, which amounts to putting a knife in his mouth as if he's a stereotypical undocumented immigrant wading through a river. Shots of Rodriguez's Paul outside in East LA are interspersed with random shots of Latinos in the city. We see Latino men stacking bags of oranges and playing baseball in the park, a young Latina holding a baby, and city residents walking past a Chicano mural in Monterey Park that pays tribute to Latin American revolutionary Che Guevara, emblazoned with, "We are not a minority." The credit sequence that opened later episodes is dramatically different, however. And let me see if I can play this for you.
But when I travel, people don't know who I am. That's why I carry the Mexican Express card.
so little cinema.
Okay, let me stop there and go back to sharing the slides. Sorry about the time lag in doing it this way. It's tricky to go back and forth between the video and the rest otherwise. So here we are. So let's see, I want to make sure I'm in the right. So in the pilot, because Paul's a comedian who works late into the night at comedy clubs, he sleeps late in the day. Paul's mother and father argue. His mother wants to let Paul sleep, while his father feels he's not working while he's making fun of Mexicans. This discussion and the rest of the episode includes quite a bit of unsubtitled Spanish. Soon other family members, including multiple siblings, in-laws, and a niece and nephew, come in noisily and have to be reminded to let Paul sleep. To the extent of cliche, all are manual laborers and service workers. The father is a gardener. Pablo's brother works as a bricklayer and goes to night school. One sister cleans houses in Beverly Hills. Another works at Kmart. And his brother-in-law works at a gas station. We see that the family is at odds over Paul's comedy. One sister excitedly imitates it, which doesn't go over well with their father. Such an approach matched the complicated and conflictual family dynamics that livened other Lear family comedies. Paul, now awake, the family eagerly turns to the TV to see his latest appearance. Described by Entertainment Tonight as a young, new Mexican comedian, a segment of his stand-up show was aired. On stage in front of a receptive audience, he performs part of a comedy set, first showing the many uses of a tortilla for Mexican Americans, including as a 30-day deodorant. He does his Mexican Express card joke, much to his family's chagrin, but making the audience laugh. Soon, Paul's new agent arrives, and Paul introduces him around the family. He teasingly describes them as the aristocrats and notes the gendered traditions they hold on to. Women in the family serve the men, he explains, and his mother is part of a crazy cult called the Sock Ironers. Jose shares his good news. Pablo has been given money to create his own television show. The family celebrates with him, especially when they learn that he wants to spend the money on them. His father is still unhappy, however. He doesn't like Paul making fun of Mexicans. They argue about whether his father is treated with respect on his own job as a gardener. But the episode ends with a poignant reconciliation. Paul learns that his father's reluctance for him to be a comedian is because of Freddie Prinz's death by drug overdose. He doesn't want his son to have a life of hardship, and particularly not to die young. Finally understanding, Paul tells his father in Spanish that he loves him dearly, and they hug. When Paul later trips and falls face first into a plate of food, his family and his father and the rest of the family laugh. Now that's funny, his father says as the episode concludes. The self-reflexivity of the final joke conveys a clear affection for its Mexican-American characters. Similar humor and family dynamics guide the other 5 episodes. There also is some surprising content as well. The 4th episode is the only one to be credited to Jose Rivera. In The Presidential Joke Teller, Paul struggles with how to present himself when he has the opportunity to perform for US President Reagan. And I'm a little torn. I think I won't show the clip just now, and hopefully I'll get a chance to show it in just a little bit. His sister Sylvia convinces him, against his father's wishes, to dress in his regular clothes rather than a tuxedo to show that he's proud of where he comes from. Unfortunately, Paul and his agent end up getting pulled over on their way to perform for the president. His mother and the rest of his family, and eventually his stern father, all come to the station to bail him out. The episode includes a few moments of commentary from a distinctly Latino point of view, such as when family members argue about whether Reagan or any president has done anything to help Hispanics. And another moment when his brother-in-law, Hector, says that he knows after a night in jail that Mexicans aren't treated well there. And the episode's premise includes a deeper critique. Its emphasis that no one believes that Paul, a Mexican American, would be asked to perform for the president. It slipped into jokes, as when Paul tells the police as he's being put in jail, "There's a room of very important people waiting for us." They're Caucasians. It's hard to imagine a white writer coming up with the episode's spot-on understanding of the outsider identity that Latinos typically might experience in these years. Even more complex and pointed about Latino social issues was the whole enchilada, which skewered both television portrayals of Latinos and Latino and Latina media advocates who fought about them. Credited to Seth Greenland, the episode is set within the backdrop of the family getting ready for Paul's niece's quinceañera, which needs to impress her nosy neighbor, Senora Alvarez, played by the late, great Lupe Ontiveros in a showy guest role. Meanwhile, Paul is offered a television series, but it's not all that he had hoped for. This is because Paul is expected to play an undocumented immigrant named Pedro Enchilada, who lives in the back seat of his car, perhaps making fun of the flimsy premise of Chico and the Man. He and his parents and sister, Sylvia, are all crushed. In addition, the family is besieged by two members of a Chicano media advocacy group who say the series would be a disgrace to Mexican Americans. They're humorless and unresponsive to Paul's quips about it. Sylvia, in contrast, says he should do the series, adding, "You've got to get on the inside to change things, and I know you will." Setting the decision aside, Paul sets up a family photo during the quinceañera, only to be interrupted by the media advocates. When the woman calls Paul a poor, foolish minso, a fool, for considering the series, Domingo, Paul's father, takes a stand. He shows them the door and slams it behind them, garnishing a cheer from the live audience. The family goes back to the photo, reveling in their posh appearance and earning shock and awe from Senora Alvarez. This prompts the first smile from Paul's mother, Rosa. As a whole, the episode is remarkable for the complexity of the commentary and clever humor, as it addressed cultural nuances and divisions among Latinos, as well as ironies inherent in networks' attempts at Latino narratives. But by the date it aired, ABC had decided not to renew the series. As a whole, I found that the series included the most intelligent and nuanced commentary of the 1980s series on Latino life. It misses out at times, however, when it depicts Rivera's from a distance that implies a white-centric narrator and white target audience. The lore about the series is that it was canceled because of its ratings. The pilot got an overnight share of 28, an impressive number, but a weekly rating of 14.9 with a 22% share, or 22% of TV sets, which in 1984 wasn't enough to sustain a network series. That was likely just one of the factors that ABC considered. Rodriguez has shared that some Mexican American viewers were unhappy with his Mexican Express card joke and other humor that they didn't like. It got canceled because of the complaints that they received from Mexican Americans, from Latinos everywhere, he noted in his interview with me. Despite a letter writing campaign by Latino fans who attempted to save the show, ABC chose not to renew it. Nevertheless, a.k.a. Pablo has had tremendous potential and, in my personal estimation, often hit the mark in relating a second-generation Mexican-American perspective with wit and good humor. The importance of network executives' taste in these decisions is illustrated in a 1988 industry executive panel on networks' consideration of fan campaigns to save series. Perry Simon, Senior Vice President for Series Programming for NBC, noted, "I saw a.k.a. Pablo and I didn't think it was very good. My guess is that they canceled it because they didn't think it was very good, in spite of all of those very legitimate factors, referring to fans' arguments of its merits as a Latino series." The importance of diversity among network executives is underscored here. A homogeneous group of white male executives will more likely share a sense of cultural taste, which becomes codified as good TV when Latinos are excluded from entering their ranks. In the case of both a.k.a. Pablo and First Time Out, which was the case study that I chose for the 1990s and have not had a chance to really talk about here, it starred Jackie Guerra as a single professional woman living with roommates and entering the professional world, trying to get into law school. In the case of both of these shows, their productions included both well-meaning efforts and a privileging of proven writers, which in effect was a reiteration of the industry's status quo. In particular, insiders' supposed knowledge of what works on TV was privileged over the insights of Latina and Latino consultants, such as was the case on the a.k.a. Pablo production, and Jackie Guerra, the Latina star of First Time Out. Given the complete lack of Latino executive producers or network executives at the time, these dynamics were silencing. One obvious takeaway after exploring a.k.a. Pablo and First Time Out's production histories is that while each hired at least one Latino writer, this was generally not considered a necessity for Latino-focused programming in the 80s and 90s. Similarly, even top-billed Latino stars had only tenuous agency with respect to the narrative content of their series. Even while the Latino population in the US was growing dramatically, the perception of a white audience, or perhaps a white and Black audience, still held sway. Meanwhile, if networks wanted to appear modern-minded and politically correct, they might greenlight and back one series with a Latina or Latino lead, but with little thought about what it would mean to do so without opening doors to Latino writers or creators. While this was the period in which the ascent of quality television and a greater cultural openness on the part of American viewers was beginning to be felt, Latino series were handicapped by networks' assumptions. a.k.a. Pablo ultimately reflected the perspectives of its non-Latino creators, including their notions of universal storytelling and comedy, which centered whiteness and resulted in oddly constructed or bland Latino protagonists. Relatedly, the national audience was presumed to be largely white and unfamiliar with Latino cultures. These dynamics are integral to why Latino cultural citizenship could not flourish in relation to television in this period. a.k.a. Pablo, like other Latino series in the 80s and 90s, faced a dynamic also of mainstreaming, to borrow a term from Yolanda Broyles Gonzalez, that diminished its ability to convey cultural truths. An overlapping term to mainstreaming would be crossover. Both movements of reaching an expanded audience come with a potential loss of cultural meaning and cultural empowerment. On whose terms do we enter? Broyles Gonzalez asks, regarding these artistic translations. Broadening the audience isn't always a progressive development, given the tendency for what she called corporate interests, a privileging of profit-making that can overshadow Latino creative integrity. This is, of course, the business of television, which includes a tension between profitable entertainment and truthful art for Latinos and for all series creators, while the continued exclusion of Latino creatives and executives in these years made it nearly impossible to resolve that tension in favor of culturally honest storytelling. And I think I have maybe a minute here. I am gonna stop here, but I want to show the slide that the video I didn't get to show you, so you can see a little bit of an actual a.k.a. Pablo show. So let's go to that. What I'm going to do is show you part of, oh, it's not really doing what okay, here we go. Part of the president's joke teller.
Speaking at the hotel, telling her Elena I got here first. They mentioned Uncle Pablo's name. Don't listen to her.
You look real handsome, Paul. Man.
Come and get me, okay? Ándale.
¿Qué dice tu papá?
Well, how do you like this Mexican kid, folks?
Oh, you're beautiful.
Can you believe it, me? Pablo Rivera, the son of Domingo and Rosa Maria Rivera, grandson to Rafael and Juanita Rivera, about to entertain the President of the United States.
When I see you this way, I believe it. Rosa, this is my silk handkerchief.
Really, Dad?
Right. I have never blown my nose into it. But tonight you can.
Hola! Oh, I'm glad I got here in time. The buses from Beverly Hills were impossible tonight. An hour and 15 minutes it took me.
Oh, you did the Patterson house, Lucia.
Sí, mamá.
Ay, vea tu hermano.
Paul, I told Mrs. Patterson that my brother was entertaining the President of the United States tonight. And she told me to tell you to do a good job because the President loves the Hispanic people and he wants us all to fulfill our potential. And then she told me to put the blue water in the toilet bowl so that I could fulfill my potential.
Where is he? Where's my famous brother-in-law? Míralo, there he is, man. I told everybody about you. Oh, you look real handsome, Paul, man. I'm so proud of you.
What a day, what a day. I mean, this is the day that I shake the hand of the man who'll shake the hand of the President of the United States. And look at you. This calls for champagne.
You're right. I'm gonna buy you a beer. Come on.
Silvia, how come you look so unhappy? I thought you wanted me to do this.
I do, Paul, I do. But you know me, I want everything. I want this opportunity for you, but I can't help thinking Reagan is using you to make himself look better with Mexican voters. He doesn't really care about us.
Of course he cares. He's the president.
He's not my president.
Ah, this is my house. In my house, the president is the president.
Silvia, don't let him fool you. You know why Papa voted for Reagan? Because he likes his hairdo. He thought he was Chicano.
Not only that, Mr. Comedian, the president keeps the dream. He loves the Mexican people. He calls us hardworking.
What good is hard working if you haven't got a job?
I'll pause right there. I just wanted you to have a chance to see an actual clip from the show. And so that was the second to last episode, the president's joke teller. And I'll end there, and I'd love to hear any questions or feedback that you might have on the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that informative seminar. I feel like in that clip alone, there was so much that we can talk about. I see so many like similar themes, even with like the power of the Hispanic Latino voting power and like the US presidency, and it's just very rich. I had the opportunity to watch, I think, 3 episodes of a.k.a. Pablo a few years ago at the Library of Congress. And I was able to like watch it and enjoy it. But what you gave us today was amazing, like giving us an actual cultural history with like marketing and interviews and reviews and really creating the landscape of what it was, both for Paul Rodriguez as well as other Latinx stars and talent and producers, which is amazing. As you were giving your conversation or your seminar, I kind of was thinking of like there's this long history of both comedians, the situation comedy, and like network failures to some degree, not for everyone. So I was thinking of like also George Lopez, Cristela Alonso, Gabriel Iglesias with like the Mr. Iglesias show. And it kind of in particular reminded me of Cristela Alonso's kind of like her own, I think it was also on ABC, so there was also like a network failure there. I guess my question is, do you see any similar themes or challenges that like Paul Rodriguez or a.k.a. Pablo had that we are still seeing even today, currently?
Certainly, and thank you. I think those are really interesting connections to make. And actually in the next chapter, I look at George Lopez in the next chapter, and then in the final chapter, I look at Cristela, and I had the opportunity to interview Cristela Alonso as well, and so it was very interesting. I think that, all 3 of these shows in some ways might be said to be sort of American dream narratives, which are very, very popular in US sitcoms. The person who comes up from, working class roots and has to really, they're very talented, but they're extremely hardworking and they have a dream and they pursue it. Sometimes their family members support them and sometimes they don't. I think, one difference between a.k.a. Pablo and then George Lopez and Cristela, I think like both George Lopez and Cristela did get to become executive producers, or at least co-executive producers of their own shows. So they had more agency. I think that Cristela Alonso did not always feel like she had that much agency. Like they almost didn't give her that credit. She had to really fight for it. Whereas George Lopez, maybe because his wife was his manager and she was very smart, I don't know. She negotiated a really good deal for him. So he did have a lot of control the whole time. Although they did pair him with two very seasoned, white male TV writers. And so he worked very closely with the two other executive producers. Whereas, Paul Rodriguez had no creative control whatsoever, just like Freddie Prinze had no creative control with Chico and the Man. I do think, like as Rodriguez has said in different interviews, a.k.a. Pablo was loosely based on his family. So he definitely felt like it was about his family. But he did, I don't know that his input was listened to even as much as that of, the two Latinas, one of whom worked for Embassy Television already. And the other woman had worked in like newspapers and maybe was a friend of the first woman. It was kind of informal in terms of how they brought these two women to come in and give some feedback. But there's similarities, but at least we do begin to see a little more agency, I guess, for the Latino professionals the next decade.
It's interesting how like the power of networking and just knowing the right person or maybe having the right manager can really drastically change that. Like I was a big fan of the Cristela show and I was very upset when it ended, but it's interesting how it's also ABC again, like 40 years later with that. I think it's hard not to talk about like Norman Lear without also not addressing like One Day at a Time. While of course it had a very different trajectory since it was like a remake. But it's interesting how like even in that situation, the networks have failed from like Netflix to like Pop TV to I think it might have ended its run in CBS. But how in terms of, I have so many questions. I don't really know where to start. I guess I'll kind of start with one direction. In terms of like the cultural history, you also talk about both the challenges and limitations of doing archival work and trying to map out both like the 80s and the 90s. And I'm assuming you probably encountered this challenge throughout your entire work. I was wondering if you can kind of share a little bit more of the additional steps that you perhaps had to do when trying to create this cultural history for us.
It was more than I had expected when I began the project. I think I was pretty naive in thinking that I would be able to find, boxes in people's closets and in fact, actually some people kept videotapes, but the problem was that videotapes disintegrated. Like if people didn't go through the work of transferring materials from a certain kind of videotape to the next type of videotape to 8-track to like things got lost in many cases. When I was doing research, especially on the public TV shows in the 1970s or late 60s, I was very sad to learn that back then, public television was just starting out at that time, and their budgets were so small that they literally taped over shows episodes for the next show. Like they didn't, it was so like there's the very first narrative about a Mexican-American family was actually produced at KCET, the public TV station in LA, Canción de la Raza. And it was set up kind of like a telenovela in that they had over 100 episodes, and I think it was like Monday through Thursday, they would air an hour of it. And there is one episode of those hundreds of episodes that survives, one episode. And it was even the very first, but then again, like there wasn't this consciousness. There's certainly like we didn't really even have Latino studies at that point in time at universities. I mean, it's just beginning to be a real thing through, you know, students staging sit-ins at different universities and things like that. So, I mean, without stewards, without people who are within those milieu, like saying, you know, at the libraries, working in the library saying, oh, this is on TV right now. It's on public television. We need to record. Like it was really fairly sad. So like, I wish I had done even more interviews than I did get to do. I think I did around, you know, maybe at least 20, 25 interviews. But a lot of the people that were involved in at least firsthand accounts are getting older and may not be able to tell their stories much longer as well. And so I kind of felt like a clock was ticking, and at times also that it was just too late. But I would do things like I looked on eBay a lot for materials, you know, because fans often were the people that kept, you know, maybe had a video. I was lucky at one point, like the a.k.a. Pablo episode that I just showed a segment of, it was given to me combined with one of the public TV series that I did research on, and he had been a producer, and it was kind of a little surprise gift that I got, like a few a.k.a. Pablo episodes that I don't think are necessarily even at the Library of Congress. But certainly photos are sometimes more likely what people kept, you know, fans. And so there are like movie memorabilia and TV memorabilia companies that had some of this stuff, and YouTube sometimes where people are uploading things. So YouTube would be another place for surprise finds. But I mean, sometimes it took so much effort to compile random, you know, artifacts about a TV series to the point where a lot of times my choices of case studies was based on when I was able to compile the most material on a particular series. So it wasn't always my choice. Like a.k.a. Pablo, in part, I picked it because I had a pretty rich body of the actual episodes and an interview with Paul Rodriguez. And, you know, so it just, sometimes it came together that way.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Oh, I'm sorry. I think.
Hi, Grace. Yes, I had just one question. If we have just one more minute, I think we're about to be on time. Thank you so much, Professor Beltrán, for this wonderful presentation. I had a question in relation to the reception side of things. So I was wondering if at the time, I'm not from like film studies, so I don't know anything about this, but I'm really curious to know whether at the time production teams would do like reception studies, trying to find out what people watching the show would feel about the show. So whether they conducted any focus groups or surveys or interviews. And I wonder whether if that was the case, if they included specifically Latinx audiences. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. It was very rare for basically the commercial media industries, film and TV, they would typically not think of including Latinos at this time. I mean, they were a smaller portion of the US population, and I think that's partly why. And there also was a misunderstanding that US Latinos only would watch Spanish language media. And so back then there was typically this kind of excusing themselves of having to think about the fact that plenty of Latinos did watch English language. And the one exception in terms of research was in public television. And in that in part was because the few Latino public affairs or like news-oriented series that began around 1970, many of them were funded by the Ford Foundation, which did want research. And so you have a case of like universities where they'll hire a researcher to do surveys of the audience and do it in a bilingual format. And then they would give that information to producers who might work in what might be called like a telecommunications department at that time at some US university, like University of Texas at Austin. So they did do some research sometimes before and after, and you know, kind of gauging, you know, they even would ask people, what content do you want, you know, what kinds of issues do you want a show to address? And so it was very different from the commercial networks.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, Crystal, for great moderation. Thanks everybody in the audience for staying with us through the end. We are a couple of minutes after time. So I want to thank again everybody and invite all the audience members and also Mary to join us next Thursday for Gillian Baez's presentation. I see she's in the audience as well. So, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Those of us in the Chicagoland area, stay warm. It's gonna get cold in the next few days. So thank you so much, and thank you, Mary.
Thank you.